The mining station Kepler 442b had been humanity's most ambitious project in the Outer Rim. Captain Sarah Chen watched through the viewport as the last evacuation shuttle disappeared into the star-speckled darkness, leaving her alone with the dying station's emergency lights casting eerie shadows across the corridors. The Zephyrian invasion fleet had given them exactly 47 minutes to abandon everything they'd built over the past decade. Sarah pressed her palm against the cold metal wall, feeling the vibrations of the station's failing life support systems. The alien attackers had been thorough in their assault, targeting the main reactor and communication arrays first. What they hadn't expected was for someone to stay behind, hidden in the maintenance shafts while their bioscanners swept the facility. The captain had always been different from other humans. Born with a rare genetic condition that gave her enhanced night vision and an unusual bone structure in her arms and back, she'd faced discrimination throughout her military career. Her fellow officers whispered behind her back, calling her the Batwoman because of her pronounced shoulder blades and her uncanny ability to navigate in complete darkness. But those same mutations that made her an outcast among humans might be exactly what she needed to survive. As the Zephyrian patrol ships circled the station like predators, Sarah made her way through the ventilation system with an agility that would have impressed even the most skilled infiltrator. Her modified skeletal structure allowed her to compress her body through spaces that would be impossible for a normal human to navigate. The aliens had left a skeleton crew aboard the station, apparently planning to strip it of its valuable quantum processors and rare Earth elements. Sarah counted at least 20 Zephyrians through the grates, their purple-scaled skin glistening under the artificial lights as they systematically dismantled human technology. These creatures stood nearly 8 feet tall with elongated limbs and heads that reminded her of ancient Earth reptiles. Hidden in the shadows, Sarah began to formulate a plan. The Zephyrians had made one critical mistake. They assumed that all humans had evacuated, and they'd shut down their perimeter scanners to conserve energy for their salvage operation. They also didn't understand human engineering. The mining station had been built with redundant systems and hidden protocols that only someone with intimate knowledge of its construction could access. Sarah crawled through the maintenance tunnels toward the auxiliary control room, her modified physiology allowing her to move silently through spaces designed for automated repair drones. Every few meters she paused to listen for alien voices or the sound of their heavy footsteps on the deck plates above her. The Zephyrians were efficient, but arrogant. She could hear them discussing their plans in their clicking, hissing language. Thanks to her years stationed on the rim, Sarah had picked up enough of their dialect to understand that they considered humans to be primitive scavengers, barely worthy of notice. They spoke of Earth's colonies as easy prey, ripe for harvesting. That arrogance would be their downfall. As Sarah finally reached the auxiliary control room through a maintenance hatch, she began accessing systems that the aliens didn't even know existed. The mining station's quantum drill array was still functional, and more importantly, it was still connected to the planet's molten core through a series of thermal conduits. Sarah's fingers flew across the emergency control panel, rerouting power from non-essential systems and preparing to give the Zephyrians a demonstration of human ingenuity. She activated the station's internal communication system, broadcasting a message that would reach every corner of the facility. Her voice echoed through the corridors in perfect Zephyrian dialect, causing the alien boarding party to freeze in confusion. "Attention, Zephyrian scavengers. You have 30 seconds to abandon this station before I demonstrate why humans are not as primitive as you believe." The aliens scrambled to locate the source of the transmission, their clicking voices rising in pitch as they realized they weren't alone. But Sarah was already implementing the final phase of her plan. She had turned the mining station into a weapon, and the Zephyrians were about to learn that underestimating humanity was a fatal mistake. Through the security monitors, she watched as panic spread through the alien boarding party. They had encountered human military resistance before, but this was different. This was one human, apparently abandoned and left for dead, who had just announced her presence to an entire squad of elite alien warriors. What they didn't know was that Captain Sarah Chen had never felt more alive. Years of being treated as an outcast had prepared her for exactly this moment. She was going to show these invaders why humans had spread across the galaxy, despite being physically weaker than most alien species. Humanity's greatest strength had never been their bodies. It was their refusal to give up, their ability to turn any situation to their advantage, and their talent for making weapons out of whatever tools they had available. The countdown continued as Sarah prepared to unleash the full fury of human engineering on the unsuspecting Zephyrians. They had made the mistake of leaving her alone with a mining station designed to crack open planets. Now they were about to discover what happened when you cornered a human who had nothing left to lose. The quantum transmitter's explosion had torn a hole through 3 decks of the mining station, creating a maze of twisted metal and exposed conduits that Sarah navigated with desperate efficiency. The blast had killed 5 more Zephyrians and wounded several others, but it had also damaged the station's structural integrity. Emergency klaxons wailed as atmospheric pressure dropped in several sections. Sarah pulled herself through a gap between 2 collapsed support beams, her modified skeletal structure allowing her to compress her torso in ways that would have been impossible for a normal human. Behind her, she could hear the remaining Zephyrians regrouping and calling for reinforcements from their fleet. The clicking urgency in their voices told her that her transmission had been successful. The aliens now knew that their invasion plans had been compromised. As she emerged into one of the station's hydroponic bays, Sarah paused to assess her situation. The good news was that her intelligence package had reached the human fleet. The bad news was that the Zephyrians were now hunting her with deadly determination, and she was trapped on a station that was slowly falling apart around her. The hydroponic bay offered unexpected advantages. The complex network of growing chambers and irrigation systems provided numerous hiding places, while the thick vegetation could mask her heat signature from alien sensors. More importantly, the bay's independent life support system meant she would have access to oxygen and water, even if the Zephyrians disabled the main environmental controls. Sarah made her way through the vertical growing towers, each one containing crops that had been intended to feed the mining station's crew for months. Tomatoes, soybeans, and hydroponic wheat stretched toward artificial suns, creating a surreal garden in the middle of a war zone. She gathered what supplies she could, knowing that she might need to survive for days before rescue arrived. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the bay's entrance as a Zephyrian patrol entered the area. Sarah pressed herself against the inner wall of a growing tower, using the dense foliage to conceal her position. Through gaps in the leaves, she watched 3 aliens methodically search the area with handheld scanners. These creatures moved with predatory grace, their elongated limbs and powerful muscles making them formidable hunters. But they were also creatures of habit, following predictable search patterns that someone with military training could exploit. Sarah noted how they focused on obvious hiding spots while ignoring the vertical spaces where a human with her unique abilities could easily conceal herself. As the patrol moved deeper into the bay, Sarah began implementing a new strategy. She couldn't simply hide until rescue arrived. The Zephyrians would eventually find her, and even if they didn't, their fleet was likely preparing to destroy the station to prevent further human interference. She needed to be proactive, to continue disrupting their operations while staying ahead of their search teams. The hydroponic bay's control systems were connected to the station's main environmental network. If Sarah could access those controls, she might be able to create additional chaos throughout the facility. She moved silently through the growing towers until she reached the bay's central control station, a small booth surrounded by monitoring equipment and nutrient flow regulators. The Zephyrians were still searching the outer areas of the bay when Sarah began her work. She accessed the environmental controls and started making subtle changes to atmospheric pressure, temperature, and humidity throughout the station. Nothing dramatic enough to be immediately noticed, but enough to make the aliens increasingly uncomfortable and paranoid. Zephyrians came from a world with different atmospheric conditions than humans preferred. By gradually increasing humidity and raising the temperature in certain sections, Sarah could force them to work in conditions that would slow their reflexes and impair their judgment. It was psychological warfare at its most basic level, designed to make the hunters feel like they were being hunted. As she worked, Sarah monitored the alien communications through the station's internal network. The Zephyrians were growing increasingly frustrated with their inability to locate and eliminate a single human. Their commander was demanding updates every few minutes, and there was talk of abandoning the station and destroying it from orbit. That gave Sarah an idea. If the Zephyrians were considering orbital bombardment, they would need to evacuate their remaining troops first. That meant they would have to gather at a central location, probably the main docking bay where their transport ship was trapped. If she could time her actions correctly, she might be able to eliminate the entire boarding party in one decisive strike. The mining station's main reactor had been damaged, but not destroyed in the initial attack. The Zephyrians had been careful to avoid causing catastrophic damage because they wanted to salvage the facility's technology. But Sarah knew the reactor systems intimately, and she understood how to turn their caution against them. She began uploading a virus into the station's computer network, a piece of code she had developed months earlier as part of a routine security exercise. The virus was designed to mimic normal system maintenance while gradually weakening the reactor's containment protocols. If activated, it would cause a controlled overload that would be impossible to stop once it began. The Zephyrian patrol was moving closer to her position when Sarah finished her preparations. She had set multiple traps throughout the station, from environmental hazards to structural weaknesses that could be triggered remotely. The aliens thought they were hunting a desperate human who was hiding in the shadows. In reality, they were walking through a maze of carefully prepared ambushes. Sarah slipped out of the control booth just as the first Zephyrian entered the central area of the hydroponic bay. She moved through the growing towers like a wraith, using her enhanced night vision and modified physiology to stay ahead of their searches. The aliens were close enough that she could hear their breathing and smell the distinctive metallic scent of their armor. As she reached the bay's secondary exit, Sarah triggered the first of her environmental traps. The temperature in the hydroponic bay suddenly spiked to levels that would be uncomfortable, but not lethal for the Zephyrians. At the same time, she released a cloud of nutrient mist that would interfere with their sensors and create visual obstacles. The aliens' clicking voices rose in alarm as their equipment began malfunctioning, and their visibility dropped to almost nothing. Sarah used the confusion to escape into the station's central corridor system, leaving behind frustrated hunters who were beginning to realize that they were not dealing with an ordinary human. Captain Sarah Chen was no longer just surviving. She was fighting back with every tool at her disposal, turning the mining station into a weapon against its invaders. The Zephyrians had made the mistake of leaving her alive, and now they were going to learn why humans had earned a reputation as the most dangerous species in the galaxy when cornered. The thermal conduits erupted with superheated plasma as Sarah triggered the mining array's emergency discharge protocol. The entire station shuddered as energy equivalent to a small nuclear explosion coursed through the quantum drill system. What had once been used to extract precious metals from the planet's core now became a devastating weapon directed at the Zephyrian boarding party. 3 of the aliens were caught directly in the plasma discharge as it vented through the main cargo bay. Their screams echoed through the station's corridors before being cut short by the intense heat. The remaining Zephyrians scrambled for cover, their confident clicking voices now replaced by panicked shrieks as they realized they were trapped aboard a station with a human who understood its systems better than they could have imagined. Sarah smiled grimly as she monitored their movements through the security network. The aliens were trying to reach their transport ship, but she had anticipated this. With a few keystrokes, she sealed the docking bay doors and activated the magnetic locks. The Zephyrian vessel was now trapped against the station's hull, its crew unable to escape. But the captain knew her victory was temporary. The main Zephyrian fleet would eventually notice that their boarding party had gone silent. She had perhaps an hour before reinforcements arrived, and when they did, they would likely destroy the entire station rather than risk losing more troops to what they would perceive as a human trap. Sarah needed to escape. But more importantly, she needed to ensure that her sacrifice meant something. The mining station's computer core contained detailed intelligence about human defensive positions throughout the sector. If the Zephyrians accessed that information, dozens of colonies would fall before they could mount proper defenses. Moving through the maintenance shafts with practiced ease, Sarah made her way toward the station's most secure area. The quantum processing center housed not only the valuable computer cores, but also the station's experimental communication array. If she could modify the long-range transmitters, she might be able to send a warning to the human fleet. The journey through the station's inner structure required all of her unique physical abilities. Her modified bone structure allowed her to navigate through spaces designed for maintenance robots, while her enhanced night vision guided her through sections where the aliens had disabled the lighting systems. As she crawled through a particularly narrow conduit, Sarah reflected on the irony of her situation. The same genetic mutations that had made her an outcast in human society were now the only reason she could move freely through the station while heavily armed aliens searched for her. Her elongated limbs and flexible spine, once sources of ridicule among her peers, now gave her advantages that no normal human could possess. Sarah emerged into the quantum processing center through a floor grate, finding herself surrounded by towers of humming computer equipment. The Zephyrians hadn't reached this area yet, apparently focusing their search on the more obvious locations where a human might hide. They still thought like the predators they were, expecting their prey to cower in dark corners rather than strike back. The experimental communication array had been one of Sarah's pet projects during her years on the station. She had worked with the engineering team to develop a quantum entanglement transmitter, capable of instantaneous communication across vast distances. The technology was still experimental and dangerous, requiring massive amounts of energy to maintain stable quantum connections. As Sarah began modifying the transmitter's configuration, she heard the distinctive sound of Zephyrian plasma weapons charging in the corridors outside. The aliens had finally tracked her general location and were preparing to breach the quantum processing center. She estimated she had perhaps 10 minutes before they cut through the reinforced doors. Her fingers moved frantically across the control interfaces as she rerouted power from every available system in the station. The lights dimmed throughout the facility as she channeled everything into the communication array. If this worked, she could send a complete intelligence package to the human defense fleet, including detailed scans of Zephyrian technology and tactical information that could save thousands of lives. The quantum transmitter began to glow, with an eerie blue light as it powered up beyond its designed parameters. Sarah knew she was pushing the equipment far past its safety limits, but she had no choice. The sound of cutting tools grew louder outside the doors as the Zephyrians worked to breach her position. Through the security monitors, Sarah watched the remaining aliens coordinating their assault. There were 17 of them left, all heavily armed and clearly frustrated by their inability to locate and eliminate a single human. She could see the fear in their movements now. They had expected to face human military forces or perhaps desperate civilians, not someone who could turn their own environment into a weapon. The quantum transmitter reached critical power levels just as the first Zephyrian plasma blast punched through the door. Sarah initiated the transmission sequence, watching as terabytes of intelligence data began streaming across impossible distances to reach the human fleet. The information included everything she had observed about Zephyrian tactics, weaknesses in their armor, and most importantly, the location and strength of their invasion fleet. But the process was taking longer than expected. The quantum entanglement field was unstable, requiring constant adjustment to maintain the connection. Sarah found herself trapped between the need to complete the transmission and the approaching Zephyrian assault team. As the aliens finally breached the quantum processing center, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her extraordinary survival. She activated the station's emergency lockdown protocol while simultaneously overloading the quantum transmitter's power core. The resulting explosion would either kill everyone in the section or create enough chaos for her to escape deeper into the station's infrastructure. The Zephyrians rushed through the breach just as Sarah triggered the overload sequence. The quantum transmitter erupted in a brilliant flash of blue energy, and in that moment of chaos and destruction, Captain Sarah Chen disappeared into the station's depths like a ghost. The power coupling crashed into the chamber floor with tremendous force, crushing 2 of the Zephyrian assault troopers instantly, and pinning the third beneath twisted metal and sparking electrical components. Sarah dropped down from her elevated position to survey the damage, her enhanced night vision allowing her to see clearly through the smoke and debris. The surviving alien was badly injured but still conscious, his plasma rifle lost somewhere beneath the wreckage. Sarah approached cautiously, knowing that even a wounded Zephyrian could be extremely dangerous. The creature's purple scales were darkened with his own blood, and his breathing came in labored gasps that suggested internal injuries. For a moment, their eyes met across the devastated chamber. The Zephyrian's expression showed something Sarah had never seen from his species before: respect. This alien had finally encountered a human who fought back with the same ruthless efficiency that his own people employed. The creature spoke in halting English, his voice barely audible above the sound of electrical fires and failing equipment. "You are not what we expected," the alien wheezed. "Our intelligence said humans were weak prey animals." Sarah knelt beside the dying creature, careful to stay out of reach of his clawed hands. "Your intelligence was wrong about a lot of things," she replied. "How long before your fleet destroys this station?" The Zephyrian's eyes were growing dim, but he managed a sound that might have been alien laughter. 10 minutes until orbital bombardment. "You cannot escape." Sarah stood and looked around the destroyed chamber. The reactor virus was still running its course, and she estimated she had perhaps 20 minutes before the overload reached critical levels. The Zephyrian fleet would destroy the station before then, but there was still time to reach the escape pod bay if she moved quickly. She made her way through the maintenance shaft that led toward the emergency evacuation systems, her modified physiology allowing her to navigate the narrow space with practiced ease. Behind her, she could hear the dying alien's breathing slowly fade away. The sound bothered her more than she expected. Despite everything, she took no pleasure in killing. The maintenance shaft opened into a corridor that had been heavily damaged by the earlier fighting. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across buckled deck plates and exposed wiring. Sarah moved carefully through the debris, aware that the Zephyrians might have left additional troops to guard the escape routes. As she approached the escape pod bay, Sarah heard voices speaking in the aliens' clicking language. Through a partially collapsed doorway, she could see 3 Zephyrians standing guard near the pod launch tubes. They seemed nervous, constantly checking their equipment and looking over their shoulders as if expecting her to appear at any moment. Sarah smiled grimly. Her reputation was apparently growing among the alien boarding party. These creatures had started the day confident in their superiority over human opposition. Now they were jumpy and paranoid, reduced to posting guards at locations they thought a desperate human might try to reach. The escape pod bay presented a tactical challenge. There was only one entrance, and the Zephyrians had positioned themselves to cover all approaches. Sarah needed to eliminate all 3 aliens quickly and quietly, before they could alert their companions or damage the escape pods. She studied the chamber's layout through the damaged doorway. The pod bay was a large circular room with 8 escape pods mounted around the perimeter. Each pod was designed to carry up to 6 humans to safety, with enough life support and propulsion to reach the nearest inhabited system. The Zephyrians were positioned near the central control console, giving them clear sight lines to most of the chamber. Sarah noticed that one of the escape pods had been damaged by weapons fire, its hull breached and its systems offline. But the other 7 pods appeared to be functional, their status lights showing green across all major systems. If she could reach any one of them, she would have a chance at survival. The key was the chamber's lighting system. Like most areas of the station, the pod bay was illuminated by overhead panels that could be controlled remotely. If Sarah could access the environmental controls one more time, she might be able to create enough darkness to even the odds. She retreated into the maintenance shaft and used her personal communicator to access the station's computer network. The Zephyrians had damaged many systems, but the lighting controls were still functional. Sarah programmed a delayed shutdown sequence that would plunge the pod bay into complete darkness in exactly 60 seconds. That gave her enough time to position herself for an assault. Sarah moved through the maintenance system until she found an access hatch directly above the Zephyrians' position. She could hear their clicking voices below as they discussed the approaching orbital bombardment and speculated about whether the human would try to reach the escape pods. 50 seconds until lights out. Sarah prepared herself mentally for what was about to happen. She would have to drop through the access hatch, eliminate 3 armed aliens in complete darkness, and launch an escape pod before the Zephyrian fleet could target her. It was an impossible task for most humans, but Sarah had never been most humans. 30 seconds. Sarah gripped the hatch release mechanism and controlled her breathing. Her enhanced night vision would give her a significant advantage in the dark, but she would still be outnumbered and outgunned. Everything would depend on speed and surprise. 10 seconds. Sarah could hear one of the Zephyrians moving closer to her position, apparently investigating some minor sound she had made. Perfect. That would put him within striking distance when the lights went out. 0. The pod bay plunged into absolute darkness as Sarah dropped through the hatch like a vengeful spirit. Her first target never knew what hit him as she landed on his shoulders and drove her improvised weapon deep into the gap between his helmet and armor. The second alien began firing wildly in the darkness, his plasma bolts illuminating the chamber in brief, chaotic flashes. Sarah rolled away from the weapons fire and used the brief moments of illumination to locate her remaining targets. The Zephyrians were calling for backup, but their communications would take precious seconds to reach the other teams scattered throughout the station. Sarah had that long to eliminate them and launch her escape. The third alien had taken cover behind the central console, using its bulk to shield himself while he tried to target Sarah with his weapon's built-in illumination system. The narrow beam of light swept back and forth across the chamber, searching for movement in the darkness. Sarah used her modified agility to stay ahead of the searching beam, moving through the chamber with impossible grace. When the alien's light passed over her position, she was already somewhere else, closing the distance between them with every passing second. The final confrontation lasted only moments. Sarah struck from an angle the Zephyrian hadn't anticipated, using his own momentum against him as he turned to track her movement. The alien's weapon clattered across the deck plates as he collapsed, leaving Sarah alone in the darkened pod bay with 7 functional escape pods and perhaps minutes before the orbital bombardment began. She chose the nearest pod and began the launch sequence. Her fingers flying across controls she could operate by touch alone. Outside, she could see the lights of the Zephyrian fleet positioning themselves for the final attack. But Captain Sarah Chen was no longer trapped on the mining station. She was about to become the sole survivor of humanity's first major engagement with the Zephyrian invasion force, and she carried with her intelligence that could change the course of the war. The Zephyrian commander's voice crackled through the station's communication system as Sarah listened from her hiding place in the primary power distribution center. The alien was furious, demanding explanations from his troops about how a single human had managed to evade capture while systematically sabotaging their operations. The frustration in his clicking speech was music to Sarah's ears. She had been moving through the station's infrastructure for 6 hours now, striking at vulnerable systems and disappearing before the aliens could respond. The environmental controls were in chaos, with random temperature fluctuations and atmospheric pressure changes, making the Zephyrians increasingly uncomfortable. 3 more aliens had been injured when Sarah triggered a controlled explosion in the waste processing facility, and 2 others had been trapped when she collapsed a section of corridor using the mining station's own construction protocols. But Sarah knew her luck was running out. The Zephyrian fleet had moved closer to the station, and long-range scanners showed that they were preparing to deploy additional troops. Worse, the aliens had begun systematically destroying the station's internal systems to prevent further sabotage. Soon she would be left with no tools except her wits and her unique physical abilities. The power distribution center offered her a chance to strike one final blow before the situation became completely untenable. From this location, she could access the main reactor's control systems and implement the virus she had prepared earlier. The controlled overload would take approximately 30 minutes to reach critical levels, giving any surviving humans time to escape while ensuring that the Zephyrians would gain nothing from their attack. As Sarah began uploading the virus, she reflected on how much her perspective had changed over the past few hours. When the evacuation order came, she had felt abandoned and forgotten, left behind because her fellow humans saw her as a freak rather than a valued colleague. Now she realized that her supposed handicaps were actually advantages that no one else possessed. Her enhanced night vision allowed her to navigate the darkened sections of the station without artificial light. Her modified bone structure let her access areas that were impossible for normal humans to reach. Even her psychological isolation had prepared her for this situation, teaching her to rely on herself rather than expecting help from others. The virus upload was nearly complete when Sarah heard the distinctive sound of Zephyrian assault troops breaching the power distribution center's main entrance. These weren't the same aliens who had been hunting her throughout the station. These were fresh troops in heavier armor, equipped with advanced sensors that would be much harder to evade. Sarah completed the upload and activated the virus just as the first assault trooper rounded the corner toward her position. The reactor's containment protocols immediately began showing signs of instability, but the changes were subtle enough that the aliens wouldn't notice them for several minutes. By then, the process would be irreversible. The lead Zephyrian raised his plasma rifle as Sarah dove behind a bank of power distribution nodes. The alien's weapon discharged with a brilliant flash, melting through metal conduits and sending sparks cascading through the chamber. Sarah rolled to her left and triggered one of her prepared traps, causing a massive electrical surge that overloaded the alien's armor systems. The Zephyrian stumbled backward as his suit's power failed, but his companions immediately moved to flank Sarah's position. She found herself pinned between three heavily armed aliens with nowhere to run. The power distribution center had excellent defensive positions, but only one exit, and the Zephyrians had that route completely blocked. That was when Sarah decided to do something that would have been impossible for any normal human. She looked up at the ceiling and smiled. The power distribution center extended through multiple levels of the station, with maintenance catwalks and equipment platforms creating a complex three-dimensional maze. Sarah's modified physiology allowed her to climb vertical surfaces that would challenge even experienced mountaineers, and her enhanced spatial awareness let her navigate the complex geometry of the chamber's upper levels. She leaped upward with surprising agility, her elongated limbs and flexible spine allowing her to grab onto power conduits and pull herself toward the ceiling. The Zephyrians fired at her retreating form, but their plasma bolts went wide as they struggled to track a target moving in ways they hadn't anticipated. From her elevated position, Sarah could see the entire chamber and plan her next moves accordingly. The aliens were powerful and well-armed, but they were also predictable. They moved like ground-based predators, focusing on horizontal threats while largely ignoring the vertical dimensions of their environment. Sarah began moving through the upper levels of the chamber like a creature designed for three-dimensional combat. She swung from conduit to conduit, using her modified bone structure and enhanced reflexes to stay ahead of the aliens' weapons fire. Every few seconds, she would drop down to trigger another trap or sabotage another system before disappearing back into the maze of equipment above. The Zephyrians grew increasingly frustrated as their quarry refused to behave like normal prey. Their commander's voice echoed through their helmet communicators, demanding that they capture the human alive for interrogation. But Sarah had no intention of being captured. She had already accomplished her primary objectives, and now she was focused on causing as much damage as possible before the reactor overload forced everyone to evacuate. As she moved through the upper levels of the power distribution center, Sarah noticed something that gave her hope. One of the maintenance shafts led directly to the station's emergency escape pod bay. If she could reach that location, she might actually be able to escape before the reactor went critical. But first, she had to deal with the Zephyrian assault team. They were too dangerous to leave behind, and they might be able to reverse the reactor overload if given enough time. Sarah needed to eliminate them, but she was vastly outgunned and couldn't afford a direct confrontation. That was when she noticed the massive power coupling directly above the alien's position. The coupling was designed to handle enormous electrical loads, but it was also equipped with emergency release mechanisms that could be triggered remotely. If Sarah could overload the coupling at exactly the right moment, she could bring down several tons of equipment on the Zephyrians below. She made her way to the coupling's control interface while the aliens continued their search pattern below. The timing would have to be perfect. Too early, and they would have time to escape. Too late, and they might detect what she was doing and take countermeasures. Sarah waited until all three Zephyrians were positioned directly beneath the coupling before she triggered the emergency release. The massive piece of equipment plummeted toward the chamber floor with devastating force, and in that moment, Captain Sarah Chen proved once again that humans were far more dangerous than most aliens realized. The escape pod launched just as the first Zephyrian plasma bombardment struck the mining station. Sarah felt the acceleration press her into the pilot's seat as the small craft's engines fired at maximum thrust, carrying her away from the doomed facility at tremendous speed. Through the rear viewport, she watched the station's hull begin to glow and buckle under the alien assault. But the Zephyrians had made a critical error in their timing. Sarah's reactor virus had been running for nearly 30 minutes, and the mining station's power core was now approaching catastrophic overload. As the alien fleet continued their bombardment, they had no idea that they were attacking a facility that was about to explode with the force of a small star. The reactor went critical just as Sarah's escape pod cleared the station's immediate vicinity. The explosion was visible from dozens of light years away, a brilliant flash that outshone the system's primary star for several seconds. The mining station ceased to exist in an instant, taking with it the Zephyrian boarding party and damaging several ships in the alien fleet that had moved too close during the bombardment. Sarah watched the destruction through her pod's instruments, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. The station had been her home for 3 years, a place where she had finally found acceptance among colleagues who valued her skills over her appearance. Now it was gone. But its destruction had dealt a significant blow to the Zephyrian invasion force. The escape pod's communication system crackled to life as it automatically began broadcasting an emergency beacon. Within minutes, Sarah heard a familiar voice responding to her distress call. Captain Martinez of the Human Defense Force, Cruiser Defiant, was requesting her status and preparing to intercept her flight. Path. This is Captain Sarah Chen of Mining Station. Kepler 442b, she transmitted back. I am the sole survivor of a Zephyrian attack. I have critical intelligence about enemy capabilities and invasion plans. The next few hours passed in a blur of rescue operations and debriefings. Sarah was brought aboard the Defiant and immediately taken to the medical bay, where doctors expressed amazement at her survival. The genetic modifications that had made her an outcast among humans had quite literally saved her life during the most intense combat situation anyone could imagine. Admiral Harrison himself arrived to conduct Sarah's debriefing, accompanied by intelligence officers and tactical specialists eager to learn everything she had observed about Zephyrian technology and methods. Sarah provided detailed information about alien weapons, armor weaknesses, tactical preferences, and command structures. Most importantly, she confirmed that her quantum transmission had successfully delivered complete intelligence about the invasion fleet's strength and disposition. The information Sarah had gathered during her desperate hours on the mining station proved invaluable to human defense planning. Within days, the Human Defense Force had developed new tactics specifically designed to exploit Zephyrian weaknesses she had identified. The aliens' overconfidence in their technological superiority became a liability when facing humans who understood their limitations, but Sarah's greatest contribution to the war effort wasn't the intelligence she had gathered. It was the psychological impact her survival had on both sides of the conflict. Word spread quickly through human space about the captain, who had single-handedly destroyed an entire Zephyrian boarding party while trapped on a mining station. Her story became a symbol of human resilience and ingenuity. The Zephyrians, meanwhile, were forced to revise their assessment of human capabilities. They had expected to face a species of weak prey animals with primitive technology. Instead, they discovered that humans could turn any environment into a weapon, and that even a single individual could pose a significant threat when cornered. Sarah was offered promotions, medals, and assignments to prestigious positions throughout the Human Defense Force, but she declined most of these honors, choosing instead to return to active duty aboard ships operating in the most dangerous sectors of space. She had found her true calling during those desperate hours on the mining station, and she had no intention of accepting a safe desk job. The genetic modifications that had once made her an outcast became the foundation for a new branch of human military specialization. Scientists studied Sarah's unique physiology and developed training programs that could help normal humans develop similar capabilities. The Chen protocols became standard training for special operations forces operating in confined spaces or hostile environments. Years later, when the war with the Zephyrians finally ended in human victory, historians would point to several key factors that had determined the outcome. Advanced human technology had played a role, as had superior tactical flexibility and strategic thinking. But many scholars argued that the most important factor was something more fundamental: the human refusal to give up, even when facing impossible odds. Sarah Chen exemplified that refusal. Left for dead on a doomed mining station, she had not only survived but had struck back with devastating effectiveness. Her story inspired countless other humans to fight harder, think more creatively, and never accept defeat as inevitable. In the end, the half-human, half-alien creature that the Zephyrians thought they were hunting had been neither half-human nor alien at all. She was something far more dangerous, a human being who had embraced her differences and turned them into strengths. The aliens had expected to face prey, but instead they had encountered a predator unlike anything they had imagined. Captain Sarah Chen became a legend not because she was superhuman, but because she was supremely human. In her darkest hour, when everything seemed lost, she had proven that humanity's greatest weapon was not any technology or tactical doctrine. It was the simple, stubborn refusal to surrender, combined with the creativity to find solutions where none seemed possible. The mining station was gone, but its legacy lived on in every human who heard Sarah's story and decided to fight a little harder against impossible odds. That more than any weapon or strategy, was why humanity would ultimately prevail in the galaxy. They had learned to turn their supposed weaknesses into strengths, and they never ever gave up.